Welcome back to the workshop, everybody. Today we have a very fun project. One of, if not my favorite sword of all time, the Falcata. We're making a fancy schmancy mono steel custom Falcata. And of course, it's not gonna be entirely historically accurate, but as you can see here, it's gonna be pretty dang close. The customer was not a big fan of the super swoopy handle, nor was he a big fan of the traditional guard shape. So I took it upon myself to alter the design slightly, not only just to make the customer happy, but also to fit my individual style just a little bit better. To make a high quality sword, you need some high quality steel. So here I have some 1/4 inch thick, 2-inch wide 80 CRV2 high carbon steel that I'm going to be forging this sword from. So without further ado, let's jump out to the forge, get it lit, and get this thing in the fire. On most swords, a lot of times you can get away with forging kind of to shape and then doing stock removal the rest of the way. But because this sword has such a dramatic profile, I'm gonna have to forge it nearly 100% to shape before I can move to the grinder. As you just saw, I do have the sword drawn on a piece of wood off to the side of the anvil so I can continuously check that I am forging it to the correct dimensions. I make a lot more knives than I make swords, but there is something about the sword forging process that is just primally satisfying and that can't really be replicated when making a Bowie knife or a chef knife. Part of being a well-rounded bladesmith is understanding the different processes that go into forging different blades. And that is one of the most beautiful parts about bladesmithing. You're using rudimentary tools like a hammer, an anvil, a vise, and a power hammer or hydraulic press to manipulate steel into wildly different shapes with a myriad of different processes and skill sets that are developed over many years. On a lot of swords, you can actually get away with using almost 100% the hydraulic press to forge them out because many swords are pretty much straight. But on this blade, I used probably 80% hand hammer and the rest on the hydraulic press to forge it out just because it has such dramatic curves and angles in it that you simply just can't do on a hydraulic press. On a sword like this, the main utility that the hydraulic press has is to reduce the stock from a 1/4 inch down to 3/16 of an inch and get the distal taper forged in. Another area where the hydraulic press comes into play and is very handy is when straightening the sword after forging. You can just put the full flat dies on there, run it through a few times, and you have a perfectly flat straight sword. After the forging is complete on a sword, I get all of that hard scale off of it with an angle grinder before I go to the actual belt grinder. After removing the scale and getting down to clean steel, I sketch on an oversized outline of the blade on the steel so that I can profile it and remove all that excess material with a contact wheel. Once it's roughly profiled, I surface grind it to about a 400 grit finish so it's nice and flat and straight, and then I put a layer of blue dicum on the edges of the steel and where I'm going to be grinding the fuller. The reason I do this is because with that blue dicum on there, once I scribe the steel with a carbide scribe exactly where I'm going to be grinding, it leaves a stark clear line so I can grind just to that line and I know I'm not grinding too much or too little. I always start with a flat piece of steel and grind my fullers before I grind my bevels. This is because if you mess up the fuller and make it slightly wider in an area and then have to go back and make the entire fuller wider to match that one area, it's a lot easier to then adjust the bevel height and dimensions afterwards. And now that our pre-heat treat fuller grinds are complete and up to about 220 grit, we can now scribe our center line on the edge that we're going to base our bevel grinds off of to make sure that they're an even thickness and dead straight. Alright, so we got the sword rough ground, still at about a 50 grit finish on the bevels. Nothing is ground to final dimensions yet. I'm still gonna put a swedge on the back here that comes out to about right there. Now I don't have the right kiln to heat treat this completely, to quench it, take it out and quench, since my long quench tank is out there and my kiln in here isn't long enough to do the entire thing tang and all, but my kiln is long enough to thermal cycle from here to here. Now I didn't do this earlier because I didn't realize that it would have actually fit in my kiln. So to stop all of the decarbonization that would happen if I did it now in its rough ground state, I'm going to coat it completely in anti-scaling solution here so that none of that decarbonization occurs on the outside and I don't have to grind extra off after I quench it and temper it. Basically what decarbonization is a rapid oxidization of the outer layer of the steel caused from high heat, which results in a loss of carbon. This causes pitting and also requires me to grind even more off the surface of the steel later. The anti-scaling solution prevents most of that from happening. So now that we have this sword completely thermal cycled, that means normalized and annealed, so the grain structure is perfect and it is dead soft, I have scraped all of that anti-scaling solution, that clay, off the outside. It kind of hardened into a shell that protected it from decarbonization, so I won't have to grind as much off after the quench. But because my kiln over there is not long enough to get the entire tang in it, and I don't want to forge heat treat this piece because it needs to have a perfect heat treat on it, we're going to be traveling to Iowa to see a good buddy of mine and fellow swordsmith, Carver Gage, who has a big sword kiln where the swords hang like this and it is plenty long, so that we can get a precision heat treat on this sword. Now, in my previous couple videos that I did swords in, I did use the forge to heat treat them, and I am pretty good at forge heat treating. I can get really good consistent results. The issue with forge heat treating is it takes a really long time, and no matter how good you are at keeping the temperature perfectly even, especially on really curvy wasp-waisted blades like this, where it has a really skinny section right here and a really wide section right here, and a super broad, thin edge, any kind of variance and heat throughout the forge heat treating process can mess up the heat treat on this. You can heat up one section slightly more than the other, which could cause a crack because it is so curved. It could cause a hotter section right here, which would end up in the most crucial part of this blade being slightly more brittle than the rest. Just a whole lot of stuff that I want to avoid. So let's head on over to Iowa and see Carver to get this thing heat treated. It is a 5.5 hour exceptionally boring drive to where Carver is over in Iowa. So I will see you when I get there. We have arrived here in Iowa with Carver over here, and that is the gigantic kiln that we're going to be using to heat treat the Falcata. I have coated the fuller and the edge and the spine in a little bit more anti-scaling solution to hopefully discourage scale from forming on those certain parts of the sword in heat treat. Now we're only going to be soaking it in there for about 15 minutes at 1525, so there's not going to be a bunch of decarb, but there may be some, and that's annoying to grind out. So we've coated those areas, and it'll make grinding afterwards a lot easier.
Hey guys, I'm Carver Gage, owner of Northern Forge, Colton's first and only true apprentice. And I make swords for the most part. I have a sword kiln. Colton comes over here every once in a while to heat treat swords. It's just way easier to do with a kiln instead of you know, trying to maneuver it in a forge and then fitting it in an oven, you know, so.
Carver was my first apprentice that I ever had, so like the first person that I actually taught how to bladesmith, how to make knives and swords and the basics of that. And he actually worked in my shop for what, like two and a half years. And then he actually moved back home to have his shop back here in Iowa. So we're about 5 hours apart now, but we still do lots of collaborations and work together on different stuff. He mainly makes swords, basically only makes like high-end fantasy inspired custom swords. He's getting into a lot of historical stuff lately. So if you guys want to check out his work, he goes by Nordland Forge. I'll tag him in the description if you want to go check him out. But he makes some really, really cool stuff. Anything you want to plug?
Forgotten.
So if you guys didn't know this, I am hugely inspired by Lord of the Rings, and that has been like my favorite series of movies ever for a very, very long period of time. Carver over here is also heavily inspired by Lord of the Rings, but he took it a step further, basically just makes fantasy inspired swords that you would see in something like Lord of the Rings. He's a lot more into the carving and the sculpting, and you'll be able to see that if you go over and check out his stuff. All right, so it's quench time. We're gonna take it out of here and vigorously quench it in this vat of Parks 50 quenching oil. All right, y'all, so now that we have the sword out of heat treat, you'll notice that I have straightened it and conditioned the flats. That is the first thing you need to do every single time out of heat treat is get your reference planes back. And by reference planes, of course, I mean the parts of the blade that are gonna be flat that you base everything else off of. The angles of the bevels, the depths of the fullers. So now I have a nice 400 grit flat surface to work off of, and I'm gonna get back over to the grinder and start profiling it up. Because the edges here, all along there and along here, are still still rough from heat treat. So I'm going to now go over and hit these with a nice 90-degree 400 grit grind to make sure all the decarb is off, if there actually is any. I don't think there is, but we'll see, and get the perimeter up to 400 grit so I can then move on to grinding the fuller and the bevels. Here you can see me using what's called a stone dresser or a grinding wheel dresser, which is basically a diamond pad of a specific grit that I use on my structured abrasives to knock off the high spots and make sure that the belt is perfectly flat and ready to cut well. Before I can get to grinding the fullers, I have to profile it up to 400 grit. This is so important because these are one of those planes that I was talking about earlier that you use as reference points for everything else. Think of this like you're trying to draw a perfect octagon. Now, this is a lot easier if you just start with a square and knock off the corners at 45-degree angles. But if your initial square isn't absolutely perfect, then your octagon is going to be all wonky, and it's going to be much more difficult to chase those issues later. In that scenario, the four sides of the square would be known as your reference planes. I won't lie, grinding that fuller was a little bit challenging simply because it curves, it flares, it doesn't have a constant depth, and it ends in points, so they had to be perfectly lined up on both sides and at the exact same level. Now that the fuller is finished ground, as you can see, I'm going to be pulling that bevel back into the tang, and so I can actually fit the guard all the way up on the tapered blade and have it be a seamless fit. Grinding bevels like this can be very, very tricky because there's wide sections and then there's narrow sections, so they can't all be the same angle of bevel. I also have to watch out that on that concave section, it is even and smooth, so there's no bumps. That can be really, really easy to mess up. After I get it to about a 400 grit finish on the flat platen, I move over to a large contact wheel with about a 600 to 800 grit structured abrasive belt. Now it's time to move on to grinding the wedge on the back of the sword. I use an angled work rest and a flat platen for this to remove the bulk of the material, and then I true it up by freehand grinding it at an angle afterwards. When you pick up and examine a piece to look for flaws, one of the first things that an experienced knife maker will look at is if the swedge bevels line up side to side, front to back, and if you look directly at the tip, they should be identical on both sides. Alright y'all, the blade is now finished ground up to about 600 to 800 grit. So that should make hand sanding quite easy. And yes, I am going to hand sand this blade simply because it just leaves a nicer finish than doing a machine finish. Also because there is a fuller, you can't just leave a machine finish on that fuller because of all those horizontal scratches in there. I am extremely pleased with the weight on this thing already. It's so light, it's so maneuverable, and it has a super nice convex thin edge that will really dig into any target. The fuller ends in that really, really nice satisfying point there that matches up great on either side. It has that beautiful curve in it as well. And as you can see, I have started that taper continuation into the tang. So that should make slotting that tapered guard slot a heck of a lot easier. Of course, I'm probably going to have to refine it a little more, but as of right now, I am extremely pleased with this sword. Just look how light it is. But the next steps are going to be drawing back the temper on the tang and then getting the guard and pommel material shaped and ready for slotting. So now we're going to head out to the forge and we're going to forge a big piece of aluminum bronze into a chunk that we can then machine into the guard and the pommel for this sword. So let's get out there and forge those fittings. Here I'm using what's called kiss blocks in the press, and basically you can stack them up to make different thicknesses so that when you press down a material like I'm doing here, it can only go down so far so you know you're getting an exact thickness and not any thinner than that. When forging bronze, it's very important to be extremely careful with how hot you're getting it. Now in this video it looks like it's screaming hot, but it's really only about red hot, maybe the upper end of red hot. If you get bronze any hotter than that, you risk splitting it and causing it to crumble as you're forging it. And alternatively, if you try to forge it when it's too cold, you can also risk cracking it there because it work hardens so quickly. As you can see, I'm just forging this one big block of bronze into a longer rectangle that I can make both the guard and the pommel from. Okay, so now that I have forged out this piece of bronze, I need to anneal it. I've heard some conflicting claims about how to anneal aluminum bronze. And if you've ever worked with aluminum bronze, you know that it is a nightmare to machine, file, drill, mill, all that stuff. So I'm gonna try something that I read on a metalworking forum specifically for aluminum bronze, and I'm going to heat it up to 1350 Fahrenheit in my kiln. I'm gonna hold it there for an entire hour, and then I'm gonna let it cool down in the kiln. Supposedly Supposedly this is gonna anneal it a lot better than water quenching it, but I guess we're gonna see. I will do anything to make this stuff easier to machine because it is an absolute nightmare. Now, before I got to this step of profiling, I actually surfaced off two opposing sides of this block to be perfectly parallel and even in thickness. This will make the next step of profiling here on a 90-degree work rest that much easier because now I know that every side that I grind is perfectly 90 degrees to the two sides that are going to be clamped in the mill as I mill it. You'll notice that I'm mainly only profiling the top of the guard that's actually going to meet up with the shoulders of the blade, and that's because that's the only part that I really need to finish profile at this stage and get it really close to final dimensions. After roughing in my profile on the top and bottom of this guard, I did take the top of this guard up to a rough 220 grit finish that's pretty dang close to finished dimensions, and that's because I don't plan on taking that much more material off the top aside from smoothing out some small bumps. And now with the help of some very careful scribing and measuring, I'm able to drill and then mill out the tapering slot for the tang of this sword to fit in. Milling an airtight slot like this takes a lot of attention to detail and is very easy to mess up. I don't use a DRO when milling, so one overturn of the hand could completely destroy the guard. As you can see, I've gotten the guard fit up pretty dang close, but to get it all the way, I have to use my air engraver setup, which is basically a very high precision chisel underneath of a microscope to carefully and deliberately remove tiny bits of material from that guard so that the shoulders of the sword can actually sit inside of the guard slightly. This creates an airtight, gapless fit up with the sword, and it looks absolutely fantastic and is extremely strong. This is yet another step of the process that is very easy to mess up. Because I'm working with a chisel, one cut that is barely outside those scribe lines could be extremely visible and basically destroy the entire guard fit up. The process of fitting on this guard took quite a few hours and was really tricky, but I'm extremely happy with the end product. As you can see, it is totally airtight and seamless. Now that I have the guard completely fit up to the sword, it's time to scribe out all of my measurement lines that will help me gauge how much material I'm removing as I begin to sculpt the guard. When I'm sculpting fittings, I take the exact same approach that I spoke about earlier, using a square to get an octagon, except on a three-dimensional fitting like this, it's much more complex. Essentially, I'm using lots of premeditated measurements and breaking down the guard into its most basic shapes, then working from those shapes to remove material. I also like to sculpt the guard one axis at a time. As you can see here, I have sculpted it in the X and Y axis, looking at it from the side, and that's where I'm going to leave it for now until the rest of the fittings are done, at which point I will begin sculpting it from the Z axis, which is essentially looking at it from the top. Alright folks, so now that we have the blade finished ground, we have that guard completely fit on and squared up, now we can move to shaping this block of wood for the handle. Now this is some really pretty box elder burl that's been dyed purple as per the customer's request, and I think it's gonna go really nicely with the antiqued bronze color of the guard and the pommel on this piece. Now there is one tricky part about this fit up, and it's that it is a curved transition between the guard and the handle, and then subsequently the handle and the pommel. So these curved fit ups always present a little bit of a challenge, especially on larger pieces, because there's more room for gaps and there's more material that I have to remove. But the first step, as always, is to get this handle block fit up and slotted all the way to the bottom of this curve right here. We'll take the guard off, we'll fit it all the way up to there. Then we'll go back, scribe on this curve, and start working on that curved fit up. You'll notice that my process for fitting up and shaping this handle piece is very similar to the process that I use for the guard. And that's because it is basically identical, and that principle of starting from basic shapes, using precision measurement tools and calibrated ways of removing material can be used to make essentially any fitting that you want. The hard part is often how to remove the material, and that's where tools and machines really come into play, like this milling machine here, like my air engraver, my many different files and chisels and scrapers, not to mention all of the different attachments and different belts that I have for my belt grinders. So I have the handle block nicely fit up to that guard, really tight with the curvature, but now it's time to bed the tang. It's kind of loose, so I fill it with some super strong epoxy and I cover the tang in grease so that once it hardens, I can pull it off just like that. The handle slot has now been bed to the tang, so it goes on the exact same way every time and has an airtight fit up. Here I am adding a threaded section onto the end of the tang by cutting a slot in the tang, tightly fitting a piece of all thread into it and securing it permanently with some MIG weld. So after a little bit of fiddling around with the fit up here, we now have the handle completely fit up and bedded to the tang here. And as you can see, we have that bit of threaded tang coming out the end now that is flattened on the sides to match the thickness of the tang itself. So now we can move on to the final structural part. What the heck? Where'd the pommel go? Oh, pommel over here. Which is the pommel and the pommel nut. So the pommel is, as you saw before, shaped. The bottom is curved to the correct diameter. Gonna fit on the end of here. And I have scribed this onto the wood and ground the wood to match that curve, as you can see right here. But before we do any drilling or milling or shaping of this, we need to make the pommel nut. Now the pommel nut is going to screw onto the end of the tang here. As you can see, I've kind of drawn an x-ray of what it looks like inside. It's gonna go about to right there, and it's gonna have a step in it so that when I screw this thing completely together, it's gonna go through the pommel into the handle, and there's gonna be that step that catches on the pommel. It's gonna torque everything down really, really tightly. So let's get to drilling this pommel nut to the diameter that we need, which is a 3/16 inch drill bit, and then tapping the hole and truing up the sides to make sure that it spins properly and has zero tolerance side to side as it screws into the pommel. Here I am using a granite block and a height gauge to outline the hole that I'm going to drill in the pommel nut, known as the inner diameter. I then scribe 2 perpendicular lines showing me the actual center so I can punch it real quick and line up my drill bit correctly. I then secure the pommel nut in the vise of my mill, being very careful to make sure that it's perpendicular to the jaws so that hole that I drill is actually straight going down the center of the pommel nut. After that, I use a tap and die set. This time I'm using a 1/4 40 NC tap to tap the inside of the hole on the pommel nut so that it matches the all thread that I welded on the end of the tang and that it screws on very securely and tightly. Now, because I do not have a metal lathe, I'm using my milling machine to chuck up the pommel nut now threaded on one of those taps and setting the depth so that the pommel nut goes into the jaws exactly where I want that step in the pommel nut to be. Now that the pommel nut is drilled, tapped, that step is ground in, and it's perfectly straight, I cut a flathead into the end, which makes it easier to put on and remove from the tang the many times that I'm going to assemble and disassemble it. One of the reasons that it's so important to do the pommel nut first is you can tailor the thicknesses and the diameters of the large and thinner part of the pommel nut to different drill bits that you can then use to drill out the actual pommel itself, so that when you're assembling the pommel and pommel nut, there is no slosh, there's no margins, and it is exactly the same diameter. As you can see here, it fits in perfectly and spins freely with no binding or catching. The fit up of the pommel nut to the pommel is always very crucial to the actual functionality of a takedown blade, and that includes all aspects of it. The angle of the hole drilled in the pommel, how tight the pommel nut is to the inside of each section, and most importantly, where that step is located both on the inside of the pommel and on the pommel nut itself. The height of the step on the pommel and the pommel nut ensures that you're using an adequate amount of threading to maximize strength. This is always the most exciting part of making a sword, which is starting to shape the fittings. Now that all of the components are individually fit together properly, how they will be for the rest of this build, I can begin the very, very tricky and difficult but very fun process of sculpting each individual fitting to its final dimensions. As you see me do quite often, for all of the fittings, I am using a relative measurement based on the flat of the blade to create a measurement grid on all of the fittings, starting with the guard. This allows me to know exactly how much material to remove and where to remove it from, and also ensures that everything is dead straight and in line with the blade itself. Now, the fit up between the spine of the sword and the guard is actually going to be flush. I'm carrying the thickness of the spine as a line going all the way through the guard and all the way through the pommel and bridged in between them with a ridge on the back of that handle material. As helpful as the grinder is, you can only do so much, so I move back and forth using different attachments on the grinder, different files, and sandpaper to get the sculpting exactly where I need it to be. As much as I've talked about the measurement and the grid system as being very important when sculpting complex fittings like this, it doesn't necessarily make the process any easier in terms of skill. You still need to be very proficient on every single tool that you're using to remove material and have a very high degree of control, and a lot of that just comes from time, repetition, and muscle memory. Alright folks, so we are now officially 1/3 of the way done sculpting this handle. We have the guard finished sculpted. The only things we have to do on that are use the air graver to add the grooves running along either side of the flat here that's lined up with the spine of the sword, and micro facet all of the hard corners here so that there's no sharp corners that could dig into your hand. And then of course the finishing patina that we're gonna do when everything else is finished up and ready to do the final assembly. Now we're gonna head over to the granite block and scribe out our layout matrix on the pommel here so that we can then shape the pommel in this axis and then start doing contouring like you saw me do on this guard. So let's now enter the matrix. Here I'm doing essentially the exact same process that I did to the guard to shape it in that Z axis. So as you guys watch me do this, I'm going to explain to you the things about this sword that I like so much. So at the end of the day, this actually turned out to be one of, if not probably top 3 favorite swords I've ever made. Now I've made quite a few swords and this isn't even close to the most complex one. However, there are lots of things on it that I appreciate a lot more. I'm always looking to improve my skills as a craftsman and bladesmith, so one of the best exercises that I have used to do that, I simply refer to as elevating. And the basis of the elevating drill is essentially quality over quantity. A lot of times when setting out to make a big, extravagant, show-stopping piece, whether it be a sword or a knife, it can be tempting to include as many separate parts as possible and make the piece look very busy. However, if you have not mastered those basic bladesmithing principles of making a piece that is thoughtfully designed, visually beautiful, and functionally superb, this can actually result in the piece looking too cluttered and messy to expert viewers. A lot of times what'll happen is more energy is put towards how many different fittings and details you can include, and less energy is put towards how well each component is executed. This piece is a good example of the elevating drill. In total, this sword is only comprised of 7 different parts: the blade, the guard, the handle material, the pommel, the 2 alignment pins, and the pommel nut. Now when you're describing this to somebody, it can sound quite plain and basic, but the core principle of this drill is to use as few fittings as possible and elevate each one to the highest level in ways that are tasteful and fit the aesthetic of the piece. A lot of times this will add even more value to the piece than adding as many fittings as you possibly can. But let's jump back into the build and describe what we're doing here. So I have just finished relieving the inside of the fit up. As you can see, I was doing that with the Dremel, and now I'm sculpting the top of the guard to establish that really beautiful ridge running along the center of it. Since I am doing this freehand on the grinder, it makes it even more tricky, especially because that surface is curved, but once I'm done there, I move over to some hand files to true everything up. A big part of bladesmithing and most other crafts is knowing when to use what tools. So you'll see me switching back and forth between using the belt grinder and using files and sandpaper, and I am very comfortable on the belt grinder removing very precise amounts of material, leaving not much that I have to do with files and sandpaper. However, using a grinder always introduces a larger risk of messing up the piece because there's so much power in a belt grinder, and one small slip could remove way too much material in the wrong spot. Now I am once again using the air graver to chisel in those grooves on the back of the pommel and the guard. I'm starting with the pommel here, and once I get those grooves to the depth and width that I want, I move over to a very sharp, tiny file and true them up. Here you can see the finished sculpted pommel. The only thing that's left to do is go back over to the vise and use some very small files to establish those micro facets. Now this is an equally tricky step to basically everything else because I want those corners to line up perfectly with the corners of the pommel. So the width and depth of each micro facet has to line up perfectly and be congruent throughout the entire piece. These little facets provide 2 different purposes, the first of which is knocking off all those sharp corners that could be uncomfortable to the user, and the second is creating small spots that we can go shine back up after we have blasted and patinaed the rest of the bronze. This will create beautiful bright lines running all along the fittings that will make all the lines pop even more and display 2 different contrasting ways that you can finish bronze. Now that I am done with the bulk of the sculpting for the fittings, I move on to sanding them up to 600 grit. This will not only provide a very smooth finish, but it will also make any of those scratches invisible after I sandblast them. Sons of Gondor, of Rohan. Check out this sword. So it is looking fan-freaking-tastic so far. We got all of the fittings, except for obviously the pommel nut and the handle material, sculpted and finished shape with some beautiful, very tasteful and complex facets and curves. And to top it all off, of course, everything is perfectly in line and straight. A really cool detail that I like on this piece was putting these tiny, tiny little grooves in on either side of the thickness of the blade that continues on through the handle all the way back to the pommel. As you saw me do earlier, I did this with the air engraver and then I cleaned it up with a teeny tiny little file just to smooth it out and make it really, really nice and consistent. I think little details like that make the difference between a really nice piece and an extraordinary piece. Something that you can look at from the side, kind of hold and swing around and not notice until you look really closely, and then you can appreciate all the subtlety that went into the design and the execution of the piece. Another really cool thing is that pommel nut is perfectly centered in the pommel, which is something that is very noticeable if it's off. So next is the very exciting step of shaping the handle material. This is always a very fun step because it goes a lot more quickly, and also in this case we have this beautiful box elder burl. So as we start to sculpt and shape this handle to match the facets in the guard and pommel, we're going to be able to see how that grain pops out. And as we sand it up through the grits, we can start to visualize what this thing is going to look like when it is completely finished. So let's take these fittings off and get over to the grinder to start sculpting this beautiful dyed purple box elder burl handle. I start off the handle making process with the block being perfectly flat and parallel to the flat of the blade, and I start breaking down the corners. As I shape this piece, I have to keep a few things in mind. The first and most important thing is the distance that I am from where it meets up to the guard. I have scratched a line outlining the guard and the pommel on the top and bottom of the handle block so that I know exactly where I need to stop, because this is going to be an heirloom fit, meaning that the handle wood is slightly going to be proud of the guard and pommel, but it needs to be evenly proud all the way around top to bottom. The things that I also need to keep in mind are leaving extra material so I can establish the facets that I want to put in this piece of handle wood. I am going to be adding facets that mimic and continue the facets on the guard and pommel on the sides, and also one running along the top. There's going to be a flat that is even and parallel with the flat of the spine of the sword that travels down into the guard, through the handle, and then out onto the pommel. Most smiths that I know of that do facets like this do it mostly with hand tools, meaning files, scrapers, and sandpaper, but I personally am very comfortable on the slack belt. I find it to be a very, very effective tool that is very efficient at getting that material removed, and if you put in enough time and get comfortable enough with it, you can achieve high precision shaping with just the slack belt, so you don't have to take a file to the wood for a super long time trying to chase those lines. I came off the grinder at about 600 grit, so I started hand sanding at 600 grit. I took it all the way up to 1500 grit, and now it's time for the first coat of true oil. Now, true oil is kind of like a varnish, although it is oil and wax based. It hardens extremely hard and deepens the color of the wood significantly. So essentially, even though stabilized wood is technically waterproof, it provides an extra layer of protection on the outside while also making the color super dark and rich and allowing you to polish the outside up to an extremely high gloss finish. I let it soak in for about 5 minutes, wipe off the excess, then let it cure for about 2 days before putting the final polish on it. And now that everything else except for the pommel nut is ready for final polishing and patinas, it's time to hand sand the sword. This is basically every bladesmith's least favorite part of making blades. It takes forever, it's very hard on your fingers, and there's really no way around it if you want that nice clean satin finish. Like I said earlier, this piece was technically up to a 600 to 800 grit finish right off the contact wheel. However, there are some very small inconsistencies that I still need to get out with some pretty arduous hand sanding. Not to mention, hand sanding fullers is not very fun. It's in fact unfun. So I start off with 400 grit sandpaper and I work my way up from 400 to 600 and then 600 to 800 before going and laser engraving in the custom engravings that the customer wanted, along with my own touch mark into the blade. I then return to hand sanding, hit it again at 800 grit to take the burr off of those engravings, and finish it off with a final pass of 1500 grit to give it that nice even shine. Now that the blade is complete, I can move on to sandblasting the guard and pommel in preparation for the antiquing process. There are many different methods you can use to antique materials, but because I want this to be an even dark bronze color, I'm using a product called brass black, which is specifically formulated to evenly darken brass, bronze, and copper. After applying a few coats of brass black, I use a piece of 1000 grit sandpaper on a small sanding rod to brighten up those microfacets and the corners and bring them back to that bright, raw bronze color that will contrast very nicely to the dark finish on the rest of the fittings. This is yet another process that has to be done very, very delicately, because one slip of the sandpaper could easily scratch that nice dark color and mess up the whole look of the piece. Because the pommel nut is made of steel, it requires a slightly different blackening process involving multiple coats of blackening solution and steel wool in between. Finally, I coat all the fittings in a layer of wax and I melt it into them with a heat gun that will really solidify that wax coating and deepen the color. Alright, ladies and gents, we are almost completely done with the sword and ready to do final assembly. The last step before we can do that is final inspection over all the pieces and sharpening the blade. Now, sharpening the blade has to be done before assembly, because when the blade is assembled, a lot of swords have the actual cutting edge go all the way to the guard. You can't sharpen this little point at the end of the cutting edge once it's all assembled without risking marring up the guard or just leaving a little part dull right there, which is no bueno. So we're gonna go ahead and sharpen this sword with the handle off and then do final inspection and final assembly. Because the edge of the blade was already almost convex down to 0, I really don't have to put that much of a secondary bevel on there, but I'm just using the slack belt to develop a burr and then knocking it off with a leather stropping belt. And now that the blade is sharp and all of the fittings are totally complete, it's time for final assembly. This was such a fun project and I'm so happy with the end result. I put a lot of effort into filming as many steps as I could and explaining the process. If this video can help or inspire one single person to go out and make something, I consider it a huge success. So finally, after weeks and countless hours of work, I present to you the finished Falcata. So here it is, the finished Falcata, which I am naming Poison because of the adage on the back, which is a Latin phrase meaning the dose makes the poison, which is significant because of who it's going to and the occasion. Every single part of this sword came out exactly how I envisioned it. That fuller is very nice and curvy. There's no bumps or undulations in the blade. The guard fit up with the handle is perfect. The facets on the back of the handle leading into the guard and pommel with those sharp grooves outlining the continued thickness of the spine all the way back. The fit up of that pommel nut, the beautifully figured purple stabilized box elder burl handle. The balance point on this sword is excellent for the type of sword that it is. Getting that balance point right was a real challenge because of all this weight at the belly of the blade and the small pommel, which does not provide a lot of counterweight. But overall, I am extremely happy with how this piece came out. I love all the curves and the lines on this blade. The Falcata and Copus are two of my favorite swords ever, and they both have this general shape to them. But I want to know what you guys think of this sword. How did I do? Leave it in the comments. Well, folks, that wraps up this video. Again, this was a custom sword, so it will not be up for sale. If you'd like to get your hands on some of my work, my website is bridgerforgeblades.com, and I have some blades up for sale on there right now. And some of them are on sale with a pretty sizable discount, so be sure to go check those out. And you can also place a custom order with me if you'd like through my custom order portal on my website. If you'd like to see more of my content, be sure to go check me out on my social media platforms, mainly TikTok and Instagram. And of course, if you did enjoy this video, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps me out a lot, and you get to see more cool videos just like this. Also, be sure to drop a like and a comment of what you thought of this piece. But if you made it this far, I want to thank everybody for watching the video, and I will see you guys in the next one.